So please recharge your glasses. I haven't quite got 150 slides, but it's not far off. So I'll try and get you to the bar again and some food by 7. I've enjoyed putting this together. There's always been sort of part of my history, as you'll see as I go through this, that has had steel running through it. There is a little bit of audience participation as we go through it, so please feel free to comment at the appropriate places. The Iron and Steel Institute then started in 1869, and it had, I think I counted 57 presidents over the years, before it merged into what became the ION3 in, I presume, in 1974 or maybe 75. I should know that. And you will see some names there that you probably recognise. So Mr. Bessemer is there in the top left, and Andrew Carnegie is there, and Carl William Siemens is there. There were many, many names that I'm afraid I did not recognise. But there we are. Those were the presidents of the Institute from those very early days onwards. And that was the first journal of the Iron and Steel Institute from 1869. And those of you with sharp eyes will see it cost 7 shillings and 6pence. So how much is that in today's money? Without Googling your calculators. £150. I did old money, of course, but how much would that have been today if you had to buy one in today's money? About £50, absolutely, not far off £50. So you would have had, I think, to be reasonably wealthy. I assume that's for one issue, not for a kind of series. I don't know how often it came out back then. And the index is very kind of interesting. It's in alphabetical subject order, which is a slightly unusual way to do it. And it went to page 196, and I'm not sure if that was all the pages, but there we are. That was the volume 1. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And those of you who have knowledge of metallurgy like Robert might recognise the structure there. I won't embarrass him by asking what it is. BCC, very good. Yeah, this is the body-centered cubic structure of one of the isotopes of iron. It's one of the most common structures. And those are the things that I will be talking about in more or less chronological order. I mean, not for each of them. I will work through starting in 1869, or indeed slightly earlier, and go through addressing all of those various things with a little bit of a focus on some of the key people that have brought the industry to where it is. Sometimes gets forgotten. But let's go right back to 1779 and the Iron Bridge at Coalbrookdale with this rather stern-faced man, Abraham Darby III. And whether he's stern-faced because he was the third or output was down or what, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was the man responsible for this rather amazing bridge, which I visited twice in my life. The last time I was there, it was being refurbished. So I was able to walk across it but not really see it. But it is a rather fantastic structure, and it is, of course, made of cast iron. And cast iron, just to kind of remind us, is brittle, stronger than plastic. Plastic didn't have to be on the diagram, but I found a diagram with plastic on it. On a stress-strain curve, if you pull cast iron, it breaks fairly easily. It's not very good in tension. It's actually very good in compression. So if you're building things that kind of, you're sitting things on cast iron, it will work really well, but pulling it apart doesn't work very well. The iron bridge is made of several, I forget how many components, but it's largely a compression-based structure. And so cast iron on a kind of elongation tensile strength curve, I'll be using this again as I see there's a lot of white space. It's relatively strong, but you can't pull it apart very much or it breaks, so it has limited uses. In 1869, it also happens to be the 150th anniversary of the periodic table, which I thought might be interesting to look at how much was known about iron back then. Well, iron is there in red, and the elements in green manganese, silica, sulfur, and phosphorus, were all sort of known to be associated with iron back then. But not a great deal was known about them. Manganese, I think, was kind of known for its desulfurizing properties. Silica was sort of there. Carbon, of course, was there. Sorry, I missed carbon out, most important. Phosphorus and sulfur were rather kind of not very helpful. It was nice to get rid of them, but nobody quite knew too much about it back then. And virtually all those other elements, to the best of my knowledge, were just not used, or if they were there, they were there accidentally. And in 1869, there were about 2,000 puddling furnaces in the UK, 6,000 puddling furnaces, sorry. They made about 2 million tonnes of wrought iron. And if you work that through, that's an average of about 1 tonne per furnace per day. Not exactly high productivity. And they're very simple furnaces. You have a fire, you put the raw materials on the hearth. The fire melts the raw materials. You have a puddling rod that you stir it with from time to time, and I'm not quite sure how often you tap them, but you get about a tonne a day of wrought iron out of these things. And then at some point, Henry Clifton Sorby came along, father of metallurgy, and I spent many hours in my metallurgy course polishing specimens. I think Robert's nodding. I think we must have both done the same. This was an enormously therapeutic exercise of polishing specimens. I don't think I ever polished a specimen of wrought iron, but that's what it looks like on the left-hand side. And these long streaks are the slag in the wrought iron, which actually looks like it might be rather damaging, but in fact added a certain amount of plasticity to the wrought iron, made it a lot more ductile than cast iron, and actually quite a useful engineering material. And Mr. Sorby allowed the development of the microscope. He inherited a lot of family money very early in his career, but he was able to devote a lot of time and effort to the research of developing optical microscopy. So wrought iron then, on that chart, is a little bit stronger, well, quite a lot stronger than cast iron, and quite a lot more ductile. That's a very useful material. And Mr. Brunel, one of our key engineers, no, still not in 1869, I will get there quite quickly. Mr. Brunel, apparently a very impatient man, he's apparently didn't even like posing for the photographer in that famous picture. He designed the Clifton suspension bridge across the Avon Gorge in Bristol when he was 24. And apparently modern computer-aided design has looked at that bridge and cannot improve on it. This is like, if you were doing a bridge like that, in that way, a suspension bridge across those straits, today it would look like that. And it's made of wrought iron. I think it used steel, it used a bit of steel, but it's fundamentally a brilliant man, a brilliant design. The Great Eastern, his steamship, also made of wrought iron, which is the purpose of showing it there. Didn't have quite such a long life. I think he just about saw it launched before he sadly passed away in 1859. And Mr. Bessemer came along. Again, a rather stern-looking man. They all seem to be rather stern-looking men with big sideburns, with one exception, which I'll come to. He had the innovation that instead of all of these puddling furnaces and all of this kind of low-volume stuff, you have a big vessel, and you pipe air through it at high velocity, and that will take the carbon out in a way that just could not be done before. And this started in about 1859, 1860, and there's a kind of rule of thumb in the steel industry that any technological development takes about 20 years to happen and be commercialized. Of course, I don't think they knew that back then, but that seems to hold right through to the present day. So that was an early converter. That's another converter. This is actually a photograph. Some of the material I have got is from the Bessemer room at the IOM3. Stuart has very kindly obtained some samples. It's probably a suitable time to pass these round. We can start with you, Mark, of course, but These are apparently made of Bessemer steel. Well, they're both quite heavy, but do pass those round. The sort of fork-like sample is an example of the fact that Bessemer steel could be welded. And that one, I think, was had a crack in it and bent to show how ductile it was. So it was an improvement on raw time. And this, so there are two gentlemen here. You can probably just about see the guy there. He's probably the worker, and I think this is probably the manager coming to inspect with his bowler hat on, standing fearfully close to that thing. You'll see in some of my other photos, the regard to health and safety is kind of scary by modern standards. Even the photographer was probably quite close to taking that picture, which is probably, I don't know the timing of this, but late 1800s, early 1900s, I would think that one. But slowly, the Bessemer process took off. Largely in the UK, it did, the steel did develop. We'll look at other countries in a second. And Mr. Bessemer, very, very creative man, many, many patents to his name. There's a lot of history of him in the Bessemer room at the IOM3, which I'd encourage you to look at if you're there. There is a cabinet, when I was last there about a month ago, there's a cabinet to the left as you go in, which has some of his drawings, which I've been able to look at previously, which are fascinating. Not just to make steel, but he did many, many other things in his life. The top right, these are some artifacts and screws which were exhibited at the International Exhibition of 1862 to show you could make screws out of Bessemer steel. And he also developed a cutthroat razor, which I did try to get Stuart to borrow, but there were certain security issues involved in bringing that from the IOM3 to here. Stuart did apparently pick it up and vouched for its sharpness, even after all this time. And the thing at the bottom, I think, was a compass that Henry Bessemer also designed. A very, very innovative man, and very worthy, I think, of the recognition that he was given. And then these two gentlemen came along. They clearly had not come across Mr. Bessemer's cutthroat razor. Gentleman on the left is Carl Wilhelm Siemens, and he worked with Pierre-Emile Martin to create the Siemens-Martin open hearth furnace, which was a kind of competing technology to the Bessemer furnace. In a sense, a little bit like a much larger tunneling furnace. I have once in my life stood inside an open hearth furnace, not while it was on, of course. I was doing some work early in my steel career in the Czech Republic when the Skoda foundry at Pilsen, where they make beer, but they also make steel and so on, they were relining one of their very old, small open hearth furnaces. And you could have fitted it inside this room. It was a relatively small one. The open hearth furnace had the benefit of very, very high quality. It was a kind of reverberatory furnace. It could take a very wide range of raw materials, but it was rather slow. It was much bigger. The Bessemer furnace, you could get 100 tons of steel out in a relatively short space of time. The quality control wasn't quite there. That was to come much, much later. So the open hearth furnace actually took off in quite a big way. We'll see, we'll look at some of the shares that the open hearth furnace had a little bit later on. Then this chap came along, the only clean-shaven man there, and poor chap only survived until the age of 35, by which time he had developed a kind of development of the open hearth furnace, with a basic converter, and that eliminated phosphorus, which was one of the key issues. I think the poor guy got tuberculosis or something similar, and died very early, but it was a very significant development. The portrait on the left is in the Bessemer room, if you are there on the right-hand side as you go in. And then, so we're in the era of steelmaking. We've got the Bessemer converter, we've got the sort of arrival of open hearth furnaces. The Brooklyn Bridge, built in 1880, still made of raw iron. I was quite surprised when I saw that. I've been across that bridge twice, and it's it is quite a fantastic structure. You'd never know it wasn't steel. It's now got 3 lanes of traffic in each direction, and the central part is a pedestrian walkway and cycleway. Incredible that it was designed with enough capacity back in 1880 to take all that traffic and be strong enough to survive. Raw time, again. And let's look at what was happening in the world of steel back then. It was a bit of a growth industry. The compound growth rate between 1870 and 1900 was about 10% annually. So if you'd been investing back in 1870, you'd probably have done quite well. In 1880, by the time the industry got established, the pie chart on the right shows the shares in 1880. The UK has nearly a third of the world. The USA has nearly a third of the world. Europe, excluding the UK, has almost a third of the world. And everything else has about, it's about 8% or something. So a quick question, what shares do the UK and USA have now? I will tell you later, but any guesses?
UK, 10%.
Nothing.
Next to nothing.
Yeah, definitely see the figures.
So I'll tell you later, right at the end. Notice China's not there. China would have been insignificant back in 1880. By 1900, the shares UK and US have gone down a bit, not very much. And the electric arc furnace, many think of it as a new kind of invention, but in fact, the first operational one, came along in 1888, and this one, which I think is not the first one, but this, I think in Italian, my Italian is not very good, it claims to be the first one, so anyway, one of the earliest ones, or the earliest one, depending on who you believe. Very small capacity. Russia got very good at electric arc furnaces. They were sort of five-ish tons capacity as opposed to today's of 150 or more tons. They used huge amounts of electricity. The quality wasn't very good, but they existed. They were used. The Eiffel Tower, still built of wrought iron. Astonishing. I didn't expect that. It used about 10,000 tons of wrought iron to make. It has been said that if it was made of steel, it would weigh about a third the weight. It probably wouldn't look like that.
So is that a financial difference? Cost?
Yes, yes. And Mr. Carnegie, I'm not going to say very much about America, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Andrew Carnegie. The portrait on the right is again a Bessemer room one, some rather nice oil paintings in there of all these various people. But he built Carnegie steel. You saw from those previous charts the size and scale of the US industry, and he had a real driving force in taking that forwards in the late 1880s, and sold it to JP Morgan. I'm not sure if they were a bank at that point or quite what they were, but he sold it to JP Morgan in 1901. And then in the late 1800s, a very significant development, the development of the high temperature thermocouple, platinum rhodium thermocouple. Mr. Ohm had been sort of toying with the idea of measuring temperature back in the 1820s, but until it was worked out, and Le Chatelier in 1885 worked out you could measure temperature with a platinum rhodium thermocouple. And then Edward Mathey, who I assume was a forerunner of the Johnson Mathey company, they commercialized it, and it was finally available around about 1900. So you could actually measure the temperature. That allowed you, there's a man taking temperature probably a little beyond 1900, taking the temperature of his open hearth furnace with, well, he's got safety goggles and an apron on it, so safety's kind of progressing a little here. It'd be pretty hot there, I would think. And then suddenly we have this, which you all recognise and will be able to draw by the end of the talk, I hope. The iron-carbon equilibrium diagram. I'm sure Robert and I could have drawn this in our sleep 40 odd years ago. So you have the, so this is the iron-carbon system. You have percent of carbon across the bottom, and you have temperature up the top. And these are the various things that happen as you solidify that system. And to the right of 2% under any circumstances you have cast iron. To the left of that you have steel. And if you remember the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is essentially what happens as you get your different types of steel. So you've seen this diagram with cast iron. I think the cross is possibly not quite in the right place, but I wasn't able to redraw the diagram in time. I think it would have broken a little bit before that cross on this scale. Low carbon steel then is much stronger, and the Bessemer samples you've passed around are almost certainly of a kind of typical low carbon steel specification. So 0.1% carbon or less, with levels of silicon, manganese, sulfur and phosphorus that are at controlled levels. The medium carbon steel is even stronger. Medium carbon steel will go up to about 0.3% carbon. And then a high carbon steel, and that's the cutthroat razor blade of Mr. Bessemer, that probably has something like that could even be up to maybe 1 or even slightly more than 1% carbon. But it's very strong, but it's quite brittle. If you break a high carbon steel, little bits of it will fly everywhere. It's quite dangerous. And then a little bit more detail. If these slides are made available anywhere, you can read those at your leisure. There's just a little bit more detail there on the exact specification. So suddenly, with the advent of the thermocouple, there is a lot more understanding of the structure, the properties, the phase diagrams. There are different, more complex phase diagrams adding in other elements and so on. So steel becomes much more understood. But it's still poured largely, once it's made into steel, it's poured into ingot molds. And the ingot molds, you've got many tons of steel in the ingot molds. The molds themselves are made of cast iron. The cast iron is made in these cupola furnaces. And I can remember these, my hometown, I think some of you may know, my hometown is Barrow-in-Furness, where there was a steelworks, a blast furnace-based steelworks. We'll look at some pictures of it in a second, that made pig iron. Eventually there became an electric arc furnace steelworks, but there was a foundry, just like that one on the left-hand side, Caird's Foundry. And you knew things were going well because you'd go down, I think it was called Ironworks Road, and you'd see twin flames coming out of the cupolas. You'd know that things were happening. They were not particularly large, and they were making, amongst other things, the ingot molds that the steelworks was using. And I can, perhaps sadly, I can remember that in my lifetime. The thing about ingot molds, they were perfectly fine. They worked very well, but there was a massive yield loss. Every time you made an ingot, all the running and rising and gating system that got the steel into the mold had to be recycled. And there was about a 25% yield loss every time you made an ingot. Perfectly good steel, it went back in the furnace, but you had to cool it down, and massive source of home scrap. And in the early, so what happened to these ingots? Well, we didn't quite jump straight into hot strip mills, but I wanted to put a diagram in of a hot strip mill somewhere. This is a very early hot strip mill at Sparrows Point in the USA, probably jumping ahead to the 1930s, rather than back in 1900. It's a massively long building, probably half a mile or more long, some of them even longer than that. So you take the ingots, you break it down, you go through a roughing mill into transfers and so on, then through a finishing mill, through cooling, and then into coiling. And the scale of that, when you're starting, even with a modern hot strip mill, the slab is typically 25-30 centimetres thick, a metre wide, maybe 10 or 12 metres long. The largest slabs these days, some of the Russian steel plants have got slabs that weigh 50-60 tonnes. So you need massive equipment, huge capital costs. Of course, that didn't all happen straight away. I'm not saying all that happened in 1900, but massive scale to these downstream processing operations. By 1930, the industry had worked out how to make steel sections, and that is part of the Empire State Building as it was erected. This time using steel, of course, not raw iron. I think that transition had happened by now. The Empire State Building used about 60,000 tons of steel, and rather remarkably went up in about a year to construct. Amazing construction. A few lives were lost, but relative to the time, it was kind of say acceptable. It's never acceptable to lose lives, but it was, for what they were doing, it was not considered to be too bad. They were hoping to moor airships on the top, but they miscalculated the very high winds in New York, so that top bit never got used for airships. And, fantastic building. I was there last year, in fact, on a very foggy day, so they get such a great view from the top. Sydney Harbour Bridge, also built between 1930 and 1932, of steel, a very high silicon steel, for reasons which I cannot, I'm afraid, remember, but it was very high silicon steel, made largely in the USA, in the UK, sorry, made in the UK. 86% of it exported from the UK to Australia, which at the time could not make suitable steel, and I presume neither could anybody else locally. So, yeah, largely a British bridge, and of course still very much in use today. Like the Brooklyn Bridge, it still has just enough capacity. Barrow Steelworks, as it was in 1936, I can't go back to 1936, but I can just remember chimneys of Barrow Steelworks. Relatively small, there isn't a scale there, but these are houses on the right-hand side. And that was what the works looked like. There are 4, possibly 5 blast furnaces. They are very, very small by world standards. I'm not sure what their annual capacities would have been. Probably no more than 30 or 40,000 tons a year. And of course, this was there because Barrow was very close to the iron ore fields in Cumbria. In 1870, the port of Barrow was the largest iron ore export port in the world. And it exported in 1870 about 100,000 tons of iron ore. And that was the largest in the world at that time. Very good quality hematite, but it ran out rather quickly. And Barrow Steelworks closed in 1963. That's an aerial view of the site. You can see the houses in the background. It's very, very compact steelworks, but there were many like this in the UK at the time and shortly afterwards. Just a reminder of a blast furnace, because these became the principal way by which liquid iron was made prior to its conversion, usually in the basic oxygen phase. You have the raw materials going in, iron ore in the form of sinter, fine iron ore that's agglomerated with coke and other things, or with pellets or with lump ore, with limestone and with coke, into the top of the furnace with various quite clever devices that allow you to charge the furnace and not let all the gases out. A hot blast of air going in at the bottom, the burden moving slowly down, sometimes coal, sometimes natural gas injected. The modern furnaces get very, very sophisticated. And then every few hours the slag is tapped off. Increasingly the slag is used for things like roads and cement and construction. And then of course the iron is tapped out. The iron is then taken usually by rail on a torpedo ladle to the BOF plant, which can be quite some distance away. And the blast furnaces are still very much in use today, and I think you'll see later the world is slowly migrating to electric arc furnaces, but not in a quick way. Going back to Barrow in 1936, these were some Tomsmer work. There are 4 gentlemen here, you can just see one at the top left. These 2 guys are working, I think this is some sort of bar that's going through a reversing type mill, hand reversing mill, as they pass this backwards and forwards through progressive reductions. Then I think that would emerge here as the Tomsman picks this one up and whips it round and goes through the next set of rolls without sort of cutting themselves in half. It looks absolutely scary. And they just look like getting on with the job. It's everyday work, which I presume it probably was back then. And then, fast forward to 1948, this man who I'm almost ashamed I'd never heard of, Robert Durham. Does it ring any bells? Didn't with me. This was the man that invented oxygen-blown steel, which was actually what really changed the industry. It got adopted by what became, I'm not quite sure what it was at the time, but Voestalpine in Austria, the LD converter. Everyone kind of thinks of oxygen steel, ND, Linz-Donowitz, from the two towns where that was created. It was this man, Robert Durham, that recognised that this was a way to improve massively on what Bessemer had done in the late 1800s with a jet of oxygen top blown down onto the liquid iron as it had come out of the blast furnace, and that was going to take out the carbon down to acceptable levels to make steel. And it would do it very quickly and in a very controlled manner. And that was one of the first, or the first oxygen converter. I don't know the size and scale of that, but it looks like it would be pretty small. And there is a man standing there, so probably just a few tons. These days they are typically up to 300 or more tons, and they will convert 300 tons of liquid iron into steel in about 40 minutes, and do that many times a day. It's a bit of a kind of forgotten hero, this man. He's the kind of standout performer of all the people, I think, that I came across. And he lived well into my lifetime, and I'm sorry that I never knew about him until a few weeks ago. 1955, I'm not going to say too much about Russia, but Russia was actually pretty switched on in terms of steel. This was the first hot metal produced at Cherry-Pogats, which is now the Severstal site, south of Moscow. Russia, the big steel sites, very well endowed with good quality iron ore, massive quantities, very often good quality coal in the right quantities. They had an issue with access to markets, but for many, many years that didn't matter because you just made steel and made all the things that Russia made out of steel with. And this was, for Russia, they got good at making iron first, making it good, and they made steel a few years later. But Severstal is still a very large, very successful steel plant. China, on the other hand, 1956, Chairman Mao, one of his many quotes, "One cannot advance without mistakes. It is necessary to make mistakes," he said. Not, in fact, about steel at the time. And in 1958, China had what they called the Great Leap Forwards, which of course was anything but. And I had never seen pictures of these so-called backyard furnaces, but that's what they look like. These armies of people making apparently very, very low quality steel, whilst the population starved. It was carried on for a few years until they realised the whole thing was not working very well at all. Fast forward to 1963, Harold Wilson in charge, and he made this rather famous quote: "The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry." And we got good at building ships. This was Barrow's largest ever ship, 1965. I remember this sailing out of Barrow, and it seemed absolutely huge relative to anything else at the time. It didn't last very long. It was scrapped only a few years later, but it was briefly, I think it may even have been the largest oil tanker in the world at the time. I'm not absolutely sure about that. Certainly the UK's and Barrow's largest ever vessel. British Steel Corporation had been formed. The industry had been nationalised in 1967, and the two key people were Lord Melchett, who was a former banker, not very well heard of, I think. Most people, I think, would recognise Sir Monty Finister, who was a a Scottish PhD metallurgist who led BSc during that period. And the newly formed BSc had 269,000 people. That's an astonishing number of people. And the board got together and they thought that there were growth years ahead, the best years lay ahead. And they put together a plan for growth that included a plan to spend £6 billion over the next 10 years, which was absolutely radical. Nobody had thought of investing so much money in the UK steel industry. And Lennon and McCartney, 1968, B-side Hey Jude, apparently, I honestly couldn't remember that bit. You say you want a revolution, but don't go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao. Well, I just thought I'd put that in. The moon landing, almost 50 years ago, and that just sort of came to me. 1969, 20th of July. But in the UK, we were still making around about half our steel, that left-hand chart, blue. We were still making probably slightly more than half our steel in open hook furnaces. I didn't realise that until I learned a huge amount by doing it. The brownie colour above that is the basic oxygen furnace share, which of course gets much greater as we go forwards, even 5 years on. There really was something of a revolution going on in the UK steel industry. And a huge number, I was astonished at the number of electric furnaces back then, but they weren't making a huge amount of steel. And so the tonnage there, we start off, the UK's making about 27 million tonnes of steel in 1969, and it drops to about 24 million tonnes of steel. And there were a few non-nationalised assets, so the total production was probably a little bit higher than that. And this was, and also over 130,000 people had been cut from the workforce over 5 years. This was an astonishing pace of change for an industry that was not known to move quickly. And of course, all this was predicated on growth, as the UK was going to grow. And at the same time, continuous casting was coming in. And continuous casting, instead of these very, very wasteful ingot molds, you now start with a ton dish of liquid metal. You feed it into a continuous caster through copper molds. In this case, you have a 4-strand billet caster. A lot of technology involved to make this work properly. And in fact, right back in the 1970s, the vast majority of world steel was still made with ingots. One of the first steelworks to use continuous casters was in fact in Barrow, where the old steelworks had closed, new electric arc furnace steelworks had started, and these two gentlemen are trying to address a cobble, as I presume this was probably a single-strand caster in those days, and it's gone off the rails, it's snaking around everywhere, and they're trying to control it without either getting killed or killing the photographer. This is totally scary. I mean, you do not want this to happen. This is only marginally better than a breakout where the liquid steel goes everywhere, which they probably had a few of as well. And I hope the gentleman survived. China. Well, very little was known about China back then, but the CIA did a study in 1979, which was embargoed until the year 2000 and is now freely available on the internet, which provided a fascinating insight into what the CIA thought China was doing back in the 1970s. And if I summarise, it's quite a lengthy document, but if I summarise that, Mao had sort of fallen out of favour but was still alive. He died in 1976. And Dong Bi-wu, if I pronounce his name correctly, was the acting chairman of the party from 1972 to 1975. And there seems to have been a consensus within China that China had put behind it the years of the Great Leap Forward, decided that they had to invest massively to allow China to grow and develop, that they needed new technology, they needed new larger plants. They went to Austria, they understood BOF steelmaking. They went to Japan, they studied Nippon's Kimitsu plant, which is still in existence today, but it started in 1965, really large, well-invested, integrated steel plant. And they targeted 60 million tons of crude steel by 1990, with a $60 billion investment over the next 2 decades. You contrast that with the £6 million the UK had said it was going to invest, which would have been worth the equivalent, exchange rates vary, but probably looking at £6 million was probably $1,200 or something like that. And the CIA concluded in 1979, with its abundant raw materials and the infusion of Western technology, China should be able to develop a steel industry comparable in size to the steel industries of the USA, USSR, and Japan. So, let me ask you to guess where China is today relative to those three economies.
Those economies
Economies
or
of steel production.
Well, the countries in terms of steel production, those three. It is well above, but can you put a number that factor how many times bigger is it?
4.
Any more?
I'll try 10.
10. I'll tell you at the end. And so, this is again a bit more audience participation. Country X and country Y. Well, it might not be revealing too much. One is China, one is the UK, but which is which? Okay, they were the same, give or take a very small amount, in 1973. Which line is which?
UK is Y.
But it's not completely obvious, I would say.
I would say that UK is red.
UK is red. Well, we'll have a look at this again in a few more years. Okay, but you know, they both go up and down. But yeah. And by the 1970s, just changing tack completely, optical microscopy is well developed. I certainly spent many hours looking down an optical microscope, drawing pictures of steel. Perlite was always kind of quite interesting to draw, lots of shading. But if you have a scanning electron microscope, it sort of comes into 3 dimensions, and it all comes alive, and you can learn a lot more about the material you're looking at. And we had, just when I was doing my degree in the late 70s, we just had access to, I think, 1 scanning electron microscope for very special purposes. And then the transmission electron microscope, these were kind of, these were reserved for real serious research people. And again, I think that there was, at Birmingham University, there was one of the few, I think, in the country at the time, high voltage electron microscopes that do really super stuff. But you could look literally at the atomic level at dislocations in steel, which I think had been acknowledged for some time, but nobody actually could see them until you could look at it. And there was tremendous learning from this about strengthening mechanisms and slip systems and sorts of things that I'm sure I should know more about than I did at the time. Massive research tools, and both with their own uses. Then Mr. Mittal, born in 1950, but he started his first steel company in 1976, which kind of fits into my chronology. He sort of left his brothers and founded, his family firm was in India. He moved to Indonesia and started, so it was a bar and rod mill, very small, PT Indo, 1976. And he sort of did all right, really. And just it's not kind of direct, well, it is directly related to steel, because it's made of steel. But I thought it was useful to look at what was happening in the world of ships, because the centre of gravity had gone away from places like Barrow Furnace and Newcastle, that were large shipbuilding centres. And this monster was built in Japan in 1979, the world's largest ship. I believe it still is the world's largest ship, 657,000 tons. It was actually too big. There were very few ports that could handle it. it was renamed several times, and I just don't know, most incredibly large beast, really. It was scrapped in India in 2010. It was called the Yarra Viking at one stage, Mont, Sea Lice Giant. I can't remember why the name's changed. It's not like people could miss it for anything, really. But that was, by this stage, not only had the centre of gravity of steelmaking moved east, but some of the large downstream consuming industries, like shipbuilding, had moved. So today, about 80 or 90% of the world's largest ships are made in South Korea, Japan, and China, which was not the case back in 1930. But some talk about steel, but not sort of end uses so much. So you probably can guess there which is which. Back to country X and country Y. We've got sort of 15 million tonnes going up to nearly 45, and we've got 27 going down to about 15. So it might be slightly more obvious what's going on here now. But then we move to the USA, and these two gentlemen, Nucor. Nucor started life, I think, in the 1960s or earlier, but became an early advocate of using electric arc furnaces to make steel. But it had only been able to make long product steel successfully. Cracking the flat product market had always proved difficult. And in 1989, SNS in Germany had developed thin slab casting. Thin slab casting looked essentially like that. It compressed everything that you saw that earlier Sparrows Point hot strip mill building that was half a mile long or whatever. This did everything, including the casting, the furnace, the finishing mill, the cooling bed, the coiler, 260 meters. The slab was about 5 centimeters thick, so the slab was about a fifth of the thickness of a conventional slab. That meant that everything downstream of that could be much smaller, could use less energy, could be less capital intensive. And SNS couldn't sell it. Nobody would adopt this new technology. They haven't got a commercial plant. And Nucor said, we'll install that. I think they sort of persuaded SNS more or less to give them the first plant. Nucor made it work. The first one was installed at Crawfordsville, which is still one of Nucor's key sites today. And there were some teething problems, and the quality of the first hot rolled coil certainly would not meet exposed automotive standards, which is the kind of benchmark for flat run steel. But it could make steel for pipe and tube uses, it could make kind of basic industrial grades, and slowly but surely Nucor developed the technology to a point where now it can be cold rolled and galvanized, and it hasn't quite reached the point where it can meet all of the specification of a modern cold mill, but it's gone a long way. And there are now more of these. I think at the last count there are something like 30 or 40 such plants worldwide. It's still a relatively small proportion of world flat roll. And that's partly because there is such a legacy of existing strip mills around the world. And steel mills got bigger. I mentioned South Korea for shipbuilding, but indeed South Korea was massively developing massive steelworks. There is a scale on there, I'm not sure if you can see, that's 500 meters. So that site is 6 or 7 or more kilometers long. At its widest or deepest point, almost the same wide, built on reclaimed land off the coast of South Korea. I've been to the sister site of this, which was built slightly earlier at Pohang, which is not quite so neatly organised. This one facility makes 22 million tonnes of steel, and much of that is consumed by downstream industries such as as shipbuilding and the automotive sector. A lot, of course, is exported either directly as steel or indirectly as cars and ships and so on. Beauty of a site like this, although virtually all the raw materials are imported, the port size is large, the logistics are good, the unit costs are good, the furnace capacities are large, and the mill sizes are large, everything is relatively modern. So this is one of the most efficient steel plants in the world. And the UK could have done this if it had decided to do so 50 years ago. Back to, well, not just the USA. In fact, I worked in Australia, 1996 to 7. It kind of seems like yesterday. I did a consulting assignment working inside of what was then BHP Steel. The development of Castrip was then known as Project M, and it was shrouded in secrecy. I never actually saw it on the inside, but allegedly this is what was going on. Steel was being cast in a relatively large pilot plant through water-cooled copper rollers on the left-hand side, then going through various other relatively simple rollers, and minimising the rolling operation. The steel is essentially cast into the finished form as rapidly as possible, and then coiled. So very compact. This whole thing is certainly less than the 260 metres of the thin slab plant. All sorts of issues containing the steel. At the end of that, those water-cooled copper rollers, the steel had a tendency to leak out the sides. Sealing that was one of the major technological challenges. Again, it was Nucor that took this on and developed it, and the first Castrip plant is at Crawfordsville, where that thin slab plant was developed. It was back in 2002. There is a second one, I think is at Blythesville, and there are others on order. I think 2 in China. There is one, you may have heard of Albion Steel, which intends to bring one to the UK. I understand that that is still very much a possibility, but maybe not for a year or 2. Massively interesting technology. It solves many issues, very compact, relatively low capital cost, makes reasonably high quality steel. But, 1996 to now, you've got more than 20 years development to get into a commercial facility, and this is not taking off and penetrating massively the existing downstream steel industry. Well, by now it's fairly clear that it was the blue line, that was China, because China's rocketing ahead. I remember I was working at the consultancy Beddoes and Company in 1993. China had done, I think in 1995, I wrote my first paper on China, when China was at about the 100 million ton mark. And I did a forecast of, I think it was about a 10-year forecast, and I remember reviewing that with colleagues, and it was a question of would it get to 200 million tons? It's a bit steep that, we better make sure that these things are realistic. So I think I had growth rates of something like probably 4, 6, and 8% compound or something. And I think we plugged for the middle one as our base case, and it was lower than 200 million tons over 10 years. And the UK has kind of, well, plateaued would be kind. I mean, it's declined. And many people looked at that by 2000 and said, well, that's it. China it's gone as far as it's going to go. It won't get any bigger than that. We were still building ships in Barrow, but we had this rather quaint way of doing it. We'd sort of build the front of a ship and move it around. We'd move it around on this massive transporter. This was 2001, it's not that long ago. This was a military vessel which I think is still in service. HMS Bulwark, should we say Bulwark? Yeah, it's just amazing that I don't think Barrow can build even these now. We can do nuclear submarines, but that's all. Meanwhile, China was building these massive shipyards that could build virtually anything. And not only China, but South Korea, Japan. Massive offshore shipyards, massive dry docks, so you can do virtually anything now. You just take a ship in, repair it, build it, haul it out of the water. Huge facilities. My name is Mr. Alston's son, born in 1976, which is not that long ago. I saw him speak in about 2006, I think, just prior to the mega merger of Arcelor with Mittal companies. Great buzz part of excitement. The story of that merger is really well told in the book Cold Steel, which I recommend to you if you want to learn more about it. Quite astonishing to put those two companies together, because there was massive resistance from all of the stakeholders and shareholders of Arsenal. That essentially the Mittal sort of charmed their way round in the end. And it really has become quite successful. And I think transfers technology pretty well within the group as well. And then the steel became involved in these very large, tall buildings, of which the Burj Khalifa, I think, is still the tallest building in the world, but only just. You have to be careful how you measure tall buildings, because some of the antennae are larger and taller. But as a building that actually has people in it, I think this is still the tallest, 828 metres high. And it is, in fact, largely a concrete rebar structure until you get virtually to the top. And then the top 100 metres or so is structural steel. There is, of course, a lot of steel in the building. There are very, very firm foundations which apparently allowed it to be made of steel and rebar. I was in China at the Baosteel facility in 2010. They allowed us to take, rather strangely, they allowed us to take pictures of their blast furnaces, but not their hot strip mill. Never quite understood that. And they allowed us to get this close to the blast furnaces, and they said, there is a fourth blast furnace, it's behind the third one. We said, can we see it? And they said, no. What was behind that? Two of the blast furnaces are of Japanese design, and two are of South Korean design. I'm not sure which was which. They're pretty large, very effective. Just jumping back to construction, the Shard was completed in 2013. I used to watch that going up at about a floor a week as I was based on the other side of the Thames, looking out over it during the construction period. Barrow Steelworks, well, of course, Barrow Steelworks is long gone. That's Barrow as it looks today. The centre of the steelworks is full of large industrial units, and I think there's actually a large Tesco where the core of the steelworks used to be. This building here, just out of interest, this is the Devonshire Dock Hall, which is where the nuclear submarines are made. That was covered in, I think, about 20 years ago, when they realised the Russian and Chinese satellites were actually looking at the construction of nuclear submarines. That's a true story. That's the Shanghai Baosteel site that I visited in 2010. You can see the scale marker there. That is a kilometre. That's a pretty large site. It's not quite as well laid out as Moscow yet, but this is about 20 million tonnes of steel making. And again, it has to import everything. Large coastal site, large dock and port facilities, everything can come in. Much of the steel, China gets kind of massively criticised for the export it makes of steel. The export ratio of steel from China is actually much lower than many other countries. When I last looked at it, it was about 13%. If you look at Japan or Germany, the export ratio, the proportion of steel that a company exports as a portion of the total made, in Japan and Germany it's about 30%. So, you know, in relative terms, China isn't doing too bad. The tonnage is, of course, a lot. Modern electric arc furnace is, well, it looks a little bit different to that one in 1900. Much bigger, driven much harder, and a lot of the technological improvements have happened in the last 30, 40 years. A lot on that slide, but just look at the energy consumption that's gone from 630 kilowatt hours per tonne to round about half that, not quite half that. The tap-to-tap time in the 1960s, you were looking at 3 hours between pours of steel. Modern furnace now you can do in about 40 minutes. And if you multiply that up, if you have a 150 tonne furnace with a unit capacity of 150 tonnes, and you do about a 40-minute tap-to-tap time, as some of the Nucor furnaces, they're even bigger, Nucor furnaces, and you run that furnace for probably not 365 days a year, but maybe 330, 340, you can very easily get to a smallish furnace that can make over 1.5 million tonnes of steel a year. You have to, of course, keep charging it with scrap and then the refractories and do all the things you have to do. But a small unit capacity furnace driven hard can petrol consumption has also fallen massively over that period. There are all sorts of other things going down that curve that have improved the efficiency. And then, more recently, the slide is aimed at automotive steels, but makes a more general point that if you look at where cast iron and wrought iron were, now there is a massive range, sort of portfolio of products. If you want a high elongation steel, well, you can't have a massively high elongation steel and high strength, the two don't go together. But you can have really high strength steels. Some of these, the third generation of AHSS is advanced high strength steel. Some of these are still being developed. Anything up to about 1200 megapascals is generally available today. You can go out and buy commercial quantities of it. People like ArcelorMittal and others will sell it to you. And then there are just all of these other things that have all sorts of different permutations of strength and ductility. And that's partly why steel has still kept its edge as a competitive material. Partly, well, the structures get quite complex, and all these things are now understood. And, there's been a massive change. The basic components of the microstructure haven't changed, but the ways in which they're used and the alloying elements are much more advanced than when I was studying metallurgy. To just relate that back to the periodic table, the elements in green have not changed, but there's probably much more control. There are then a further 18 elements that I've counted that I used in various ways to alloy or microalloy, because they're usually not there in great quantities. And all of this talk, by the way, has been about carbon steel. I should have made that clear at the start. I've excluded developments of stainless steel with large proportions of chromium and nickel, which is a kind of specialist territory. I think stainless steel appeared on that previous chart. All of these other blue elements are used in some form in some steels, and are much more understood as well. That's the contribution, I guess, of the periodic table. A brief diversion into construction. Steel, about half the steel in the world is used in the construction sector, and construction or infrastructure in some way. This gentleman, Professor Lou Kahn, who I discovered some years ago, is not well known, except perhaps in structural engineering circles. Bangladeshi origin, and he had really advanced the understanding of the use of steel in structures, and really said you can make much more sophisticated structures, many of which, as you move to the right-hand side here, use tubular type structures that are much stronger than the traditional core with kind of steel around the outside. And some of his designs, the Willis Tower, the former Sears Tower in Chicago, is actually of that design. Very, very strong, inherently strong structures. You can see there isn't actually a timeline on this, but it's more or less by time as buildings have got larger over the years. And they could not have done this without the use of more steel, more advanced steel over time. I thought it was useful to look at the development of a tall building. This has now become, I think, 22 Bishopsgate. It's had various other names in its past, and it's just a stone's throw from here, probably only 200 or 300 meters in that direction. This is what the site looked like in 2009. I was working nearby, so I was able to take photographs of it. Bishopsgate is running there. There's various structures to stop Bishopsgate collapsing into a large hall. And by the middle of 2010, the rebar cages and piling has been completed. These things are going down probably about the depth of this room into the ground. The first concrete has been poured. All of this took probably over a year just to prepare the site and do all this excavation and deal with the complaints from all the neighbours, because this was quite noisy, quite disruptive, and quite dirty work as well. It was held up several times. Massively busy site. There was a lovely little observation window where you could go and take these pictures. And you can see the previous picture was of that section, but still, the first tower crane had gone in. And then more and more steel goes in. This is really, really thick, 30, 40 millimeter rebar going into the foundations and pilings at the bottom, and this is all covered with concrete. Combination of concrete and rebar being particularly strong. And then I think the next picture jumps right ahead. I took this photograph a few weeks ago, and I see today it's still not complete. It's not far off. And this, I believe, is going to be, it's not quite as tall as the Shard, but will be the tallest building in the City of London. It's taken much longer than it should have done because the money ran out after that first phase. And in fact, the building was completely redesigned. It's now a little bigger than it was going to be. I think it's about the same height as it was going to be. Oh, what is this? This thing. Oh, very good. Gosh. Somebody's, very on the ball. Where is it then? Oh, very good. Gosh. I thought this might be baffling audiences, but there we are. It's at the top of Taipei 101, 728 tons of steel plate, computer controlled, so that when the building moves, either in an earthquake or just in heavy winds, the computers push this thing in the other direction to counterbalance the sway of the building. These things are frequently used. Sometimes there are several of them and they're smaller. They're quite frequently used at the tops of tall buildings. So let's look at right back to 1870. Just remember my early chart of where things were. Well, of course, China has rocketed ahead. And last year, the world made, well, I extrapolated slightly to 2020, but last year the world made nearly 1.9 million tons of steel. Slightly more than half of that was made in China. And USA share has gone right down, Europe and so on. And you can see, I mean, this is a pretty massive growth industry. Much of that growth has happened in the last 30, 40 years. The industry itself, 150 years in the context of the entire history of materials, is nothing. You think about bronze and stone, all the other materials. This is a pretty modern material. You look at the percentages, and remember, the percentages on the left are the same as you saw for 1880. Well, you only got, I think you saw all of those. The UK has gone from 31% down to 0.4% in that period. Yes. The other includes all the Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, kind of everything in the rest of the world that isn't Europe, USA, or China has grown to 35%. Europe has gone down from 30 to 8. USA has fallen from 31 to 5. And China has gone from 0 to 52. And I think not too many people saw that coming. The CIA got the direction broadly right, but were horribly wrong about the numbers. So I'll show you some more numbers in a second. And if you look at what's happening then, the left-hand chart, the UK, the relationship of true steel use, which is a definition that the World Steel Association uses to encompass both direct and indirect steel use. So if you use something as steel, it's obviously used as steel, or you export it as steel, it's steel. If you export a ship or a car, they try to assess the amount of steel that is used in either the import or the export. It's a little bit of a complicated and difficult calculation, but they try to work out what they call true steel use. Do the same for the UK and China. You can see there that as GDP per capita grew, per capita usage of steel in the UK has fallen, and it is sort of, I think we're at about 250 kilograms per capita now. China is only at about $10,000 per head of GDP. And some people look at this and say, well, the usage is far too high. It's 400 and something kilograms per capita. It will never be at that level. Well, it won't. But if you look at where the UK was, you can run this way. When the UK was at 10,000, we weren't quite at 400, but we were probably at 350. It wasn't that different. And it's taken quite a long time to come across to wherever we are now. I'm not quite sure what we are in GDP per capita. It's probably going down. China's got quite a lot of developing to do. So eventually, my contention is it will look a little bit like the UK. There are massive country differences, but in essence, as China develops, the steel use per capita will come down in time, but it will take quite a long time to come down. So China's going to grow before it declines, is my view. And if you look at what's happened, so that's the country X, country Y, run up to date. That is what happened. Every year, I think, for the last 10 years, people have looked at China and said, it's not going to grow, it's not going to decline. And, really kind of supposedly smart analysts have looked at this and said, it's going to go down, it's going to go down. And they've nearly all been wrong. There was a little bit of a dip. The whole industry went through a dip at the end of 2015. But then it staggered everybody by coming back with 928 million tonnes last year. There's a question of will it crack a billion? I think it will. I think it will get to a billion. It will peak and it will then slowly come down. When will it get to a billion? Sometime in the next decade. I think it will get there. What is the factor? This is what I was asking you earlier. Well, China now makes 120 times the level of steel it made in 1973, when the two countries made the same amount of steel, and 22 times. Now, in fairness, the comparisons are not quite the same. I realise I've done the numbers here. The other comparators are actually of 2018 numbers, not 1973 numbers. So 22 times Germany, 13 times Russia, 11 times USA, 9 times Japan, 9 times India. Those are based on the 2018 numbers. But say the CIA got the direction right, but the numbers are horribly wrong. So if you employ the CIA for anything, be careful. Nearly there. What's going to happen? Well, I've given you my thoughts on China. This is a view put together by some colleagues I work with very closely, people at MCI Metals Consulting International, Andre Cotas and James King, who's been economic forecaster to the metals industries for more years than me, or Andy here. By 2040, MCI still on the net, James King are forecasting just over 2.5 billion tonnes of steel. It's not actually a very ambitious compound growth rate, it's less than 1.5% compound growth. The proportion of electric arc furnace steel grows quite a lot, but it's still less than half of all steel making by 2040. If you were to see China within that, you'd see China peak in 2030 and then decline again, but not decline massively. It's still very big by 2040. You wouldn't also see much growth in Africa. I've not said anything about Africa, not because it's unimportant. It is important, but its time will come. The GDP levels, the per capita steel usage, South Africa is ahead of the game, but relatively small in the overall scheme of things. Egypt and some of the North African countries are starting to develop. Overall, it's kind of Africa is probably 2 decades away from becoming really massive overall scheme of things. And that is it. I'm sorry it took so long. It took even longer than I thought it would. I used many sources. Thank you to MinSouth for inviting me to do this. I very much enjoyed putting it together. And I've used many sources in putting this together. And I hope you found it useful. I think it's time to stop and have something to eat and drink.